Welcome to Week 3, Generating Testable Questions. In this week, we'll be looking at ways to capitalize on students' natural desire to play with the world around them. We hope to capture this curiosity in the form of questions that can launch a great inquiry process, one that will lead to rich gains in both science and language. Our guiding question for this week: how can teachers help bilingual students, especially those at the intermediate proficiency level, generate testable questions? We will break down this phase of science inquiry into 3 steps: brainstorming questions to engage students, generating one broad scientific question to guide the class, and finally forming narrow, testable questions which will lead student groups directly into hypothesis testing. In addition to the science inquiry steps, we'll look at 3 language strategies to go along with this phase. These are moves teachers make to help bilinguals get the most out of the inquiry process. So let's dive into the inquiry science process in 3 steps. We start with a wide range of questions brainstormed by students during direct observation. The teacher will first guide the class to a single but broad scientific question. Student groups will narrow the question further into a single testable question used to guide their research. Students probably brainstormed questions during the observation phase of inquiry discussed in Week 2. Let's take a look at an example. This student completed a simple I notice, I wonder chart while observing a meandering stream of water. While her observations are not those of an expert and her conventions in handwriting are not polished, she can likely read her notes to later list 4 questions. These questions are a great start and are close to what we need from the end result of our process. What happens when I turn up the water? What happens if you move an object in the water's path? Note that they were facilitated with only a chart and a direct observation experience. Because our goal is to encourage maximum language production and participation, it is preferable to leave the brainstorm questions as they are. Students' questions will reflect their language and content abilities. They might have errors in content, such as personifying the water. Why does the water want to turn? Or errors in language usage, such as an incorrect auxiliary verb. How fast do it go? While the errors can provide information for the teacher, these are issues to notice and address at a later time. For now, the attention should be focused on producing questions based on the observation and sharing them with classmates. Once students have shared brainstormed questions, we can move to step 2, where teacher and students jointly decide on a single guiding theme or question for future research. Great teachers can encourage questioning while still directing the class toward a single question. You can support student curiosity and investigation beyond the classroom with statements such as, "Some of these questions sound like they could be the title for a great story or poem," or, "This question seems like a great one to take to the library." In the process of identifying a guiding scientific question, the teacher can rephrase a common student question using the language of science. "Why does the water want to turn side to side?" is rephrased to, "Why does a stream of water sometimes meander?" Careful rephrasing helps students bridge the gap between home language and academic ways of speaking. In crafting a guiding question, our goal should be joint production as a class. Ideally, the teacher and students work together to synthesize or identify a common question which emerged during the brainstorming phase. It's okay for the teacher to guide the class toward the question intended to be investigated. However, the process will lose some of its authenticity if the teacher ignores student questions in favor of his or her own idea. Note that these guiding questions for the class can be broad questions that are not directly answerable through a single experiment. For example, a class might focus on the question, "Why does a stream of water sometimes meander?" The final step is to get each group directed toward a single specific testable question. This testable question will launch student groups into hypothesis testing during the next phase of inquiry. In the example, a class trying to understand meandering would do well to try to determine what factors affect the process. A teacher might ask the class, "Think about our observations of meandering water. What are some variables we could change about our stream that might affect the meandering?" Teachers can support students by listing variables as a class, modeling question writing, providing examples, and providing question or sentence stems. We'll discuss later how to use sentence stems to help all learners, but especially bilingual learners, during this step in the inquiry process. Our goal is to have each student group create their own testable question, a narrow question that tests the effect of a single variable. The best questions are the ones that students feel some degree of pride and ownership, especially ones where the answer is unknown. If you can get student groups to develop their own testable question, you're on your way to a great inquiry experience that can lead to rich discussions with connections to literacy and math. So far, we've focused primarily on getting the science work done. Now let's turn to some corresponding strategies that can be used to promote academic language development during this inquiry process. We'll look at careful consideration of grouping, question walls, and variable sentence frames. The first strategy, useful in all phases of the inquiry process, is careful student groupings in your classroom. Most bilinguals are in mixed classrooms with native English speakers. Now, imagine yourself in a Russian science class, and you must come up with scientific questions in Russian in front of a group of native Russian-speaking scientists. This is intimidating and anxiety-producing. Whenever you think of grouping students, consider the anxiety factor for bilinguals. A discussion of all the factors that go into grouping is beyond the scope of this week's learning, but we'll briefly examine 4 aspects of grouping and summarize some of the recommended best practices for student-led inquiry. First question to ask is group size. Most research on cooperative learning recommends a group size of 4 for maximum collaboration and communication. The second concerns the home language of the students. A third consideration is the skill level of the students in terms of science, math, and literacy. Using mixed ability and language grouping for cooperative tasks has both pluses and minuses, and varying the groups over the course of the year is highly recommended. Final consideration is what role students will take during the cooperative work. Assigning and rotating group roles and tasks within the cooperative group is considered best practice and is especially important within mixed groups. A teacher with a critical mass of students with the same language background can choose to group students by home language. This allows students to use the home language and/or English with peers of a similar language background. Students may experience an increased ability to make meaning of the content in their home language and decreased anxiety about sharing. When used, it requires a plan for flexible grouping and reporting out to the class. It's important to note that the exclusive use of language groups is problematic. It could be perceived as segregation and could limit the ability to form a cohesive classroom learning community. Those who learn English as their first language are likely unaware of all the tricky syntax required to form questions in English. Take the statement, "Water always flows downhill," and try turning it into a question. If you said, "Does water always flow downhill?" note how naturally you added an auxiliary or helping verb and how you modified both the auxiliary verb do and the regular verb flow. Giving students question stems and examples is an important strategy for helping bilinguals take part in class discussion. Frequent practice in the context-rich environment of a science investigation will build fluency. You will have the option of exploring question walls in greater detail during the Explore and Make It Work parts of this week's learning. Our third and final strategy, sentence frames, can add the right amount of structure for all learners without discouraging creativity. The right frames will help bilingual learners capture scientific thinking with a higher academic register. This will be especially important as groups write narrow, specific questions for their research. Most narrow, testable questions should follow the form, will blank affect blank? For example, will the temperature of water affect the amount of meandering? Varying the sentence frames, making it more open for experienced learners and more scripted for less experienced learners, is an essential practice. You've organized your class into mixed groups of about 4 students, carefully considering the social and language assets of your bilingual students. You've created a poster or wall to support question formation. You've prepared the right sentence frames for students to use in forming their testable questions. With these strategies in place, we hope you're on your way to lead students to a great inquiry experience. Happy questioning!